You look at Brampton, a city of about 600,000 people and 5 federal ridings. All 5 MPs are Liberal because there was a wave. They all won. And all 5 are Sikhs. For 25 or 30% of the people, they have 5 MPs. They are all Sikhs.
As a Sikh, you should be happy about that, but you don't sound happy.
Well, I think you cannot force the other people to the corner just by manipulating the nomination system and manipulating the leader.
Welcome to Wrong Speak, the podcast about the things we believe to be true, but cannot say. I'm your host, Jonathan Kay. In this week's episode, I'll be talking to Niru Kumar, the host of a new Toronto-based podcast called Desiland, which focuses on modern South Asian life in North America. You may know Niru from her work with the CBC and TVO here in Canada, but I know her, full disclosure, from the time we first met in Montreal more than 20 years ago. And as a longtime friend, I'm excited to see what she'll be doing with Desiland. After talking about her plans for the new podcast, Niru and I will dive into one of the big topics that she'll be tackling on Desiland, the problem of Sikh militancy here in Canada and around the world. We'll be joined in that conversation by veteran Canadian Sikh journalist Balraj Deol. As listeners will learn, he's been accused of wrong speak by fellow Sikhs in the past, and on one occasion paid the price for that in dramatic fashion. But before we get to Balraj, here's my one-on-one conversation with Niru Kumar, founding host of the Desiland podcast. First question, what does Desiland mean?
It's a little bit of a made-up word, and it's a play on words sort of this idea that Desis, which are people who are from the Indian subcontinent but who no longer live there, who live abroad, it's the land that we are now living in. So we kind of called it Desiland for all of those Desis who live in North America.
Is it the equivalent of diaspora land?
We're pretty much focusing on the South Asian diaspora. And we're interested in talking about modern life in North America because we've left some of our traditions and our cultures behind. And what does it look like here? And how do we fit in or how do we not fit in here? What are the tensions that come up, in our day-to-day lives or as we navigate through career paths and parenting and all sorts of issues. So because we're necessarily from a hybrid culture, we have different issues and challenges that maybe others don't face or not quite in the same way. And so we're dedicating a mainstream podcast channel to talk about those things.
Now, we're having this conversation in Toronto, and you and I are both originally Montrealers.
Yep.
And we both grew up in an era and in a place where there weren't a lot of South Asians. Now we're here in Toronto, where especially in certain areas like Brampton, there are hundreds of thousands of people of South Asian ancestry. How much of your experience in a place like Toronto, which is pretty multicultural, can be generalized to listeners of South Asian origin in Atlantic Canada or in other parts of North America where they still feel kind of isolated?
Well, that's a good question. And I think what I've noticed about different diasporas and how they evolve is that we each customize to our local culture slightly differently. So when I take a global view and I think about some of the people that I know that are of Indian descent in Trinidad, for instance, they share certain common cultural points with me, and yet we also diverge in certain ways because they've adapted to their local culture. So it's quite fascinating to see, they might be more religious but speak less Hindi, whereas I speak more Hindi and might be a little bit less religious. So we kind of customize it in our own ways. So taking that as an example, because I haven't grown up in Atlantic Canada, I haven't grown up in BC, I don't know how generalizable my experience is. I do know that I'm an urban, well-read person. And I think that I can understand, at least I know intellectually, that people are somewhat different. And the South Asian, just calling us South Asian is maybe even misleading in the sense that we're not of one type. As you mentioned, we're so many different groups within what comprises this notion of South Asian. We're from India, from Pakistan, Bangladesh, even the Maldives, Afghanistan. Like there's a lot of different groups, Nepal, like there's so many different people. And let me give you an example. When I was in India, even just thinking of me as one dimensional, like I'm Indian, let's just say I'm of Indian descent, not even South Asian. I traveled in North India and I spoke Hindi or Punjabi as needed. And then I went to the south of India and I was speaking in a hotel to somebody who was serving us. And I was speaking in Hindi, thinking fully well that I would be understood because that's the national language of India. And he couldn't understand me. The guy serving me had no idea what I was talking about. So our common language was English. So even within the Indian culture, there are so many different differences. I can't claim to speak for everybody. I won't claim to speak for everybody, but what I can do is understand that there are nuances, there are differences between and amongst us, and that we need to actually, talk about what those differences are when they're relevant as a point of discussion. So I hope to bring in as many of those voices from the diverse South Asian communities on the podcast as possible.
Your own background is Hindu, and I know that a lot of the expatriate Hindu communities in Western Europe and in North America were created in the latter half of the 20th century in the shadow of a great tragedy, which was the many millions of people who died after partition. Mm-hmm. How much of that tragic history creates commonalities with, for instance, Jewish people in Canada, who many of whom, not all of whom, but many of whom came after the Holocaust, or for instance, maybe Armenians who came here at an earlier time after the genocide in Armenia. How much of the experience of the diaspora for South Asian peoples in Canada is colored by some of the tragedies that took place in South Asia?
Tough question. I would say maybe our experience is somewhat similar. Like I imagine that many people who have lived through the Holocaust, but they're of the older generation. And so I think the generation that immigrated here certainly have an ability to see things with more compassion for other groups who have suffered as well. I think that because they live that experience and they carry it with them, and in some cases, the people that come to Canada bring that trauma with them, and it affects how they function. Really, I mean, at a certain level. So I think people who experience certain genocide or violent acts in other countries, I think when they come here, they can find parallels and understand what other communities have gone through. I think those create bridges of understanding and empathy. I'm the next generation, and I wouldn't say that we lack that empathy, but we don't have that lived experience. But we do have the knowledge of what our parents went through. I didn't know this until very recently. My dad doesn't really talk about it much, but at the time of partition in India, he was living in the Pakistan side. And there were camps that were set up to migrate people and safeguard them. And there were 3 different camps in the area that my dad was being sheltered. One camp was being guarded by a Muslim guard. And one camp was being guarded by a Hindu, decidedly like a Hindu guard. But there was one camp, and he was in that camp, and it was more neutral. And maybe that worked out to their advantage, because the ones that were more aligned with one faith or the other were also targeted when they put people on trains to cross borders. And there were mass killings at that time as vast numbers of people were migrating. My dad was put on a train, and he was a child at the time. And all the grown-ups, this is his memory. He was on this train for a while. Like for the first few days, they were on a railway station, just waiting for a train to come, and these something that would be safe enough for them to travel by to India. Anyway, when they got on this train, they traveled some distance, and then it stopped because it was surrounded by troops of the opposite side. And what they really wanted to do was pull out all the Hindus and kill them. And the adults tucked all the kids, my dad included, underneath their legs in that small space behind your legs in the compartments. They tucked all the kids behind their legs and just told them to be quiet, and they were not allowed to make a peep for hours. They sat there like this with their lives hanging in the balance. I had no idea that my dad's existence in those moments was that precarious, but he was luckily guarded by a neutral guard, and these people were negotiators, and they somehow managed to get the train to get to its destination, and the people were unharmed. So I think my dad probably carries that trauma with him, and I'm sure that it has colored the person that he is. But at the same time, he also came to Canada to create a different life for us, one that's more secure and safe. And this is why I think we value what Canada is and what it means to us. And he gave us that life.
What you're describing is almost like a scene out of Schindler's List. And yet we don't hear about, in Canada at least, really strong enmity between South Asian Muslims and South Asian Hindus and Sikhs and other groups in the same way, for instance, we do in regard to the Middle Eastern community and some other communities. Do you think that's because of successful bridge building between these communities, or is it simply people willfully putting the past behind them?
I think the common understanding that I have been given to believe is that people have come here to escape those traumas. You don't leave your native culture, your native land, you don't leave your relatives, everything that's familiar to you and comfortable, in order to bring the worst part of that experience with you. And I think in their case, at least this is my impression, because we do generally get along for the most part amongst each other. And I think it's because people just want to start a different life. They really want to focus on the things that you focus on with your family. Just a good house, raise your kids well, good education for the kids, all the little things that make life important is, I think, the trivia of life is what they want to focus on. They don't want to deal with those big things anymore. That's the motivation for many immigrants to come to Canada, I think.
I guess I'm dating myself here, but there was a period in the 80s and the 90s when white people in North America discovered Bollywood and Hindi music, and it did change things. I guess you were in college during that period. Did you feel that?
Totally. We weren't cool kids by any stretch, and assimilating was not seamless for us. But then I look at my youngest sister's experience, and as she was going through high school, being Indian was cool. Like, if you were one of the Indian kids, you were a cool kid. And everything changed. And I think it has a lot to do with entertainment and fashion. Those two industries are so powerful, and they create bridges that are non-political bridges, if I can put it that way.
The effect of technology.
And the effect of technology, so you can share these things, right? So suddenly it became pretty interesting and cool because we had exotic things that fascinated the Western world. And the more we fascinated the Western world, the more, like Madonna, she went and put on bindis and henna tattoos and that kind of thing. It created certain... she became like a cultural ambassador, or all of these items or things became cultural ambassadors for us and allowed for us to showcase certain aspects of our culture that people could connect to. And so now if you think about Indian food, for instance, many people who are not Indian enjoy Indian food all the time. And in fact, one of our episodes that we're going to be talking about was this very controversial, in my mind anyway, Washington Post article that I read that said, "Why is delicious Indian food so unpopular in the US?" I was like, unpopular? Everybody I know loves Indian food, which is the kind of language that we use to connect with one another. So it's a point of commonality. People can connect with me because they say, "Oh, I love Indian food. What's your favorite Indian restaurant? What's your recommendation? What do you think about the curry spice? Or what masala blend, masala mix garam masala mix do you use?" Or like, people are savvy enough to be able to have that conversation with me and know enough about certain points of my culture that we can have these conversations.
Yeah, although that said, it's a double-edged sword, right? Like, on certain university campuses, if you're talking to somebody from outside the South Asian community and they asked you your opinion on Indian cuisine, you might report them for a human rights offense because they had committed the microaggression of assuming you would know about South Asian cuisine simply because of your skin color.
You know, I understand.
You don't have to answer
okay,
that.
Thank you.
That's just my mini speech about that.
About microaggressions and about, in some cases and in some communities, it makes perfect sense because of where they're at in the evolution of history and time, that they're going to be more sensitive. So
Once you get a little more power,
but our diaspora is now in its second or third generation of fitting into North American society. And here's the reason why this podcast exists. It's because you would think that by the second or third generation, it's actually pretty seamless. But it's not. I'm not suggesting that there's tensions galore. I'm just suggesting that there are more points of tension between the two cultures than you would think, even as you get further into our evolution here.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because you're sounding very upbeat about your podcast, which is great. I'm sure there will be a lot of upbeat episodes, but there is a pretty heavy theme in some of your first few episodes of your podcast. You're talking specifically about the Sikh community and the militancy within some minority parts of that Sikh community. As somebody who's Hindu, does it give you pause to focus on parts of the community that don't share your own religion, that don't share your own specific background? Is that something that you're nervous about as you launch this podcast?
I think it would be a lie to say I'm not nervous about it, because I'm cognizant of the fact that I want to respect these various communities, and I want to make sure that I don't misrepresent them in anything that I say, which is the reason that I'm talking to a number of people who have immersed themselves in the issues in the community, or who are from within the community themselves. So yes, it does give me pause, a little bit of anxiety. As you mentioned, it's a pretty heavy topic. It's about the separation of the state of Punjab from within India. It has lost its traction in India, but what I'm finding kind of fascinating, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of, are some members of the Sikh community agitating for something that no longer is even sought for from within India. So, like, what is happening in Canada, and how strong is this movement?
On the other end of the spectrum, topic-wise, I believe your first episode is about a comedian named Sugar Sammy, who, as I understand it, tells jokes in how many languages?
Okay, this guy is outstanding. He's so interesting. So can you imagine standing at a mic and doing stand-up in English? Like, it's a terrifying prospect just in one language. This guy does it in 4.
And what are those languages?
So English, French, he grew up in Quebec, in Montreal, and Hindi and Punjabi, because he grew up in an Indian household, a Hindu Punjabi household. And so he was required, like when he was growing up, his parents just insisted that he speak to them in Punjabi. So he's incredible. He's huge in France. He's huge in Quebec. He's becoming popular outside of North America at a very rapid rate, Middle East and in the South Asian continent. He's hilarious. We just sat down and he had a conversation about everything: life, love, politics.
Niru Kumar's podcast is called Desiland. It's available on iTunes and all other podcasting platforms. Thanks for joining us on Wrong Speak.
Thank you.
Balraj, you and I first met, I guess it was about 15 years ago, and the subject we were discussing back then was Sikh radicalism in Canada. What has changed during that time, if anything?
During this time, they have become more organized. They have become more politically powerful. So the young generation has joined them. Canadian-born youth has become part of this movement. So it is much stronger at the base now than it was 15 years ago.
And yet, as an observer who is outside the Sikh community, and indeed outside the South Asian community, I do see less overt signs of it. You know, I remember 10, 15 years ago, there was stories about prominent displays at temples of posters and radical figures and that sort of thing. I don't see that in the news as much.
It is not in the news, certainly, because I think the news media has exhausted reporting it. But they are there. The display of terrorist portraits are there in the temples. During the Vaisakhi and other parades, now there are several of them all across Canada and even in USA and Europe. Those portraits are there. They are displayed there. Slogan shouting is there.
I remember when you and I first met, I was shocked at how vibrant and diverse the Punjabi language media was in Canada. There was something like 12 Punjabi newspapers available in the Greater Toronto area. And I think there's fewer now, but still quite a lot. Is it fair to say that the Punjabi Sikh-oriented media in Canada is divided between moderate and militant voices?
Yes, that division is there. The number of newspapers have come down, but there are more radio shows now, and there are more IPTVs now.
Tell us what an IPTV is.
IPTV is online TV. Somebody can work from home or make a small studio. They don't need to go to established cable network like, say, Vision TV or something. So people have established a lot of those IPTV. You need a small little box to access it through internet. And there are now so many all over the world, not only in Punjabi community, but in other communities also. And you can access via internet. So there are some specific pro-Khalistani IPTVs established in Canada, in USA and elsewhere.
I remember when we spoke in the past, there was real danger within the community, sometimes faced by moderates. Tara Singh Hayer was murdered. I guess it was about 20 years ago in British Columbia, as part of what is believed to be an intra-Sikh feud. And of course, Ujjal Dosanjh was brutalized, it is believed because of his views. Is there still a climate of danger? I know you're somebody who's a prominent moderate within the Sikh community. Is there still a climate of danger?
The danger is still there. You cannot rule it out. But somewhat it has declined due to a lot of attention of the media and intelligence agencies. Some part of this movement, the separatist movement, has realized that if something violent takes place, it will cut them to size, like it will affect them badly. So they are a bit careful to do or promote anything like that beyond a certain limit in Canada, but they're doing it.
So as noted, we have Niru Kumar here to ask some of her own questions. Before we get to her, I just want to ask one follow-up question, which is about the effect of Jagmeet Singh, who, of course, as we have this conversation, he's still leader of Canada's national NDP. How was he perceived within the Sikh community before he became a national figure?
His background is from a very radical separatist organization.
And what's that organization called?
That organization was a youth organization named Sikh Activist Network. So he started his activities with Sikh activists. As a matter of fact, he is one of the founders of Sikh Activist Network. It was very radical Sikh youth organization. Then it started establishing its units maybe in some universities and so on. They started holding a couple of very big gatherings of the youth. And both of those gatherings was connected with incidents of back home. For example, they will hold
back home in Punjab.
In Punjab. So they will hold one very big event in June, and then for the Golden Temple incident.
So this is 1986?
1984.
1984.
So 1984, the Golden Temple operation by Indian Army to flush out the terrorists took place. There are merits and demerits. We can disagree or agree on a lot of things. I'm very critical of some of the things. But this Sikh Activist Network will hold yearly commemoration of that incident in June, and they will name it When the Lions Roar. Now, then they will hold a second event every November to commemorate the killings of Sikhs after murder of Mrs. Gandhi, and they used to name it Tears and Ashes. So those were very large events, like up to 1,000 to 1,500 youth will attend. And I think slowly Canadian intelligence agencies started watching it. And after a few years, they disbanded this group somehow and changed into some other sub-organizations. Jagmeet left it and joined NDP. But that basic support of that kind of youth, which he organized in the beginning, is there with him.
Balraj, you've talked about the fact that there are moderates and the fact that there are some extremists within the Sikh community. I'm curious because you're on the ground in Brampton. I'm curious about a few different things. First of all, do you go to Gurudwara regularly?
Not regularly, but I do go every now and then whenever it's necessary, or some social event or some relative invites me for some religious ceremony.
There are several Gurudwaras, I imagine, in Brampton.
Yes.
The membership of these Gurudwaras, you know the people in these communities that attend, and you have social interaction with them. Can you identify the views that they espouse? Do you know if many of them support the idea of Khalistan, or whether they are more moderate and in line with your own views of Khalistan?
It's a very complex situation when you look at the setup of the Gurudwaras. When you look at the congregations of Gurudwaras are very, very large, of all Gurudwaras in Brampton or in Rexdale area, because the Sikh population base is very large. Now, the congregation doesn't have to be member of that Gurudwara. You can go to any Gurudwara. You don't have to be a member.
I could go to the Gurudwara.
Yes, as a matter of fact, anybody can go to Gurudwara. A non-Sikh can go to a Gurudwara and go and share we call it langar, the common kitchen. You can go eat. Nobody will ask any questions. From that side, it's a total freedom. There is no restrictions of any kind. But when you look at the management of the Gurudwaras, most big Gurudwaras, they are controlled by those people who support Khalistan movement. Some are very active to support it. Some are on the second line. I will give you one example. For last year in January, the Sikh Gurudwaras of Greater Toronto and some from other parts of Ontario, they got together and they boycotted the Indian diplomats. They say they are not welcome at the temples. They called a press conference at Malton Gurudwara and they announced that Indian diplomats are not welcome. They won't be allowed in the Gurudwaras. Now, all those managements, why they made this decision, they give several reasons. They say, well, they interfere in our internal politics and so on. But again, the basic thing working behind was that they are supporters of a separate Sikh state, and they feel interaction of Indian diplomats with the congregation or the Sikhs will cut them to size.
So, would you say that the atmosphere of the Gurudwaras or these holy places is somewhat politicized?
It is totally politicized when we talk about Khalistan. It is also politicized when we have like main events of Vaisakhi, when they have the parades, when they call the local politicians, whether it's from the civic, provincial or the federal level, I mean Canadian politicians, when they invite them, they want to impress them with the huge gathering of congregation. And a lot of politicians think that all these people who are here on a special festival or a parade, they are supporters of a specific group which has invited them, which is not the case.
In fairness, though, this happens in all sorts of ethnic groups across Canada, right?
Yes.
This is sort of a ritual of Canadian political life. I'm wondering how much the rise of Jagmeet Singh has affected this dynamic. Has there been efforts within different factions of the Sikh community to get him to espouse a particular position? How has his presence on the national scene changed the internal dynamics of Sikh politics?
You see, the Sikh activist network he belonged to was a radical Sikh fundamentalist group with a little bit of left ideology. So that group, with Jagmeet Singh heading it, ended up getting close to Jack Layton. That's how he joined.
And Jack Layton, of course, being the former and unfortunately deceased NDP leader here in Canada.
So he became close to Layton, and Layton was a very attractive personality. So Jagmeet and Layton, they found something common among them. NDP wanted a foothold among not only among the Sikh community and other minorities, but also in Peel region where NDP had.
This Peel region. In the surroundings of Toronto.
That's right, where NDP was non-existent. So here was a group leader which has a youth following of considerable numbers and very motivated. So they found a common ground. And that's how Jagmeet Singh jumped into politics. But he took all his base with him, all the support with him, and that youth which was working with him as a Sikh activist network, they started working for him as an NDP politician in the beginning, as a candidate for the federal.
But presumably, Jagmeet Singh has had to moderate his message and moderate his politics because of the attention he's getting. And I know that as part of this podcast, there's been talk with Terry Molesky of the CBC, and that interview. In that interview, you could see Jagmeet Singh trying to walk the fine line between a moderate national voice and perhaps catering a little bit to some of the factions that originally helped him rise to prominence. Have you seen any evidence that there is a moderating of his views now that he is a National Party leader?
I think he was forced to moderate his views. He was very hesitant to condemn the portraits of terrorists, including Talwinder Singh Parmar, and accepting Justice John Major report as a genuine
That's
one.
That's on Flight 182.
That's right. He was very, very hesitant, and he was criticized in national media very, very heavily. I think within NDP, there were people who questioned his position.
But within the Sikh community and Punjabi language media, what was the coverage of that controversy like in the days after the Terry Molesky interview? Were there people who jumped on some of the radio shows defending Terry, or was it largely hostile to Terry Molesky for asking questions about that?
Most of them were hostile to Terry Molesky, and they were defending Jagmeet Singh, not only in print and radio, but also on Facebook and other social media, barring few people like myself, who were very clear on the issue that on terrorism, a Canadian leader has to take a very, very clear line. You cannot make happy your own silo, and then we will have fragmentation of the whole Canadian society. You must appeal to the national consciousness of Canadian, and the national standard you must meet. But most of the media, most of the community activists, they stood by Jagmeet for that. And if Jagmeet changed, it is due to the pressure of the national media and pressure from within NDP to take a genuine position.
Let me ask you this. You say that most of the community stood by him, but is it most of the vocal community, or is it in fact most of the community? How are we splitting up the moderates and those who don't feel the same way?
That's a very genuine question, and it will cover some other aspects of what's happening in the community. When we say moderate and radical or separatist or fundamentalist, I still believe that moderates are in very large numbers. They are the silent majority, but they are quiet. They are nowhere to be seen, nowhere to be heard.
Why are they quiet?
My own research into it, that question bothered me a lot because I'm active in the community for almost more than 40 years. I discovered that in every community, there are 8 to 10% people who are active in politics or about politics. The tragedy of the Sikh community, and especially the Canadian-born Sikh youth, is those who are active in politics or about politics or supporter of politicians, 8 or 10%, they are all on the one side, which is the radical side, fundamentalist side, separatist side, or soft separatist side. I haven't met a youth, Canadian-born Sikh youth, who is opposing this view and saying, hey, this is not right. I haven't met any.
Do you think that's a result of fear of speaking out? Because as Jonathan has pointed out, there have been repercussions to members from within the Sikh community for having moderate views and for speaking out against any kind of radicalism. So do you think it's a fear, or do you think it's just a lack of interest?
No. There are a number of factors. The fear was there, which has decreased somewhat. I don't know whether temporarily or it's a long-term effect. So the fear was there. But then if you join them, there were gains to be made. How they flourished into Canadian politics, using the nomination system, manipulating the nomination system, managing to elect MPs, MPPs. So if you are a youth, you are active, you have political ambition, where would you go? You won't go join a moderate line or a moderate thought where you will have so many opposing from your own community.
It was a pragmatic choice.
That's right. So you will join those who will stand behind you and say, hey, this person is good, let's elect him because he will work for us. Plus, there was too much propaganda from 1984 onwards showing that we are victims. Look, we are victims.
And to be fair, I mean, let's give some credit where it's due that it was a terrible time in politics and in society in India, in Punjab and in Delhi. There were the Delhi riots and many innocent people were slaughtered, and it was the result of vigilante mob kind of justice, call it what you will. If you were related to any of those families and if you were here, you would probably feel a sense of compassion for the people who lost loved ones there in such a senseless way, and if nothing had been done about it. So I understand the grief of the community as well. And I think it's important to acknowledge that as well, but not to bring the rest of the politics here in Canada. And, you know, the violence is where I think we draw the line. I mean, an eye for an eye. We can't carry on in this way. So I think what perplexes me is amongst the members of the Sikh population, and I see that it's pragmatic for those who potentially want to go into politics, but what about the average, you know, the aam log who want to go to the temple and who see these posters that are up and these portraits that are hanging of terrorists? Do they not repudiate that? Do they not bring it up to the management or the leadership of the temples and say this is not consistent with my beliefs of Sikhism? They won't do it because the managements won't accept anything from the congregation of that sort. So people simply go to the temple to do their own rituals. They think it's not my business. Whatever they are doing is, you know, once I have done my prayer, I'm out of here. That's not my business. So people don't question them. But at the same time, if the same separatist leaders sitting in different temples or different organizations, if they try to hold something to promote Khalistan out of the temple, especially they can call for a meeting or a rally, the same people who don't question them there, they won't support them outside either. They don't show up.
So they don't show up. So the Khalistanis, if they try to hold some sort of event outside of the temples, without the help of the temples, they don't get support of the people.
So they necessarily have to use the temples.
That's right. So they are using the temples because you have a ready-made crowd right there. You have a ready-made crowd. But I must come back to your first point, the incidents of 84, whether it was June 84, the Golden Temple issue, or the rioting and killings of Sikhs. The Delhi and elsewhere after the murder of Mrs. Gandhi, it was a very, very painful. The way government dealt with was totally unacceptable. The way they followed up for years, they neglected it. It is very, very painful. But the question in my mind, which strikes me more, is that you cannot justify violence because something happened to you. You cannot justify that. Let's counter it with violence. And I do feel that the violent, which violence took place in Punjab, the terrorism which took place in Punjab after 84 June and November 84, actually is one of the reasons why the justice was not done. Because those people who were fighting for justice, they were sidelined. In order to deliver justice, you need political pressure. You need people with you. You need intellectuals and lawyers working on it, gathering the evidence, filing the evidence, so that once the terror started, everything stopped. So all those cases and everything stopped.
One of the themes that you saw in the Canadian media when Jagmeet Singh came to power was the idea that his position of leadership with the NDP would have a galvanizing effect on visible minority voters. And there's a sort of reductionist attitude whereby visible minority voters sort of vote as a bloc, which I've always thought was naive. And then we had a by-election result in the Scarborough, part of the Greater Toronto area, in which his party did very poorly, despite the fact that it's actually one of the most diverse ridings in Canada. Do you think that in the general media, not talking here about the Punjabi language media, but the English language media in Canada as a whole, there is a naivete about how people within South Asian communities and visible minority communities more generally vote, because they're often described as sort of one bloc?
Well, I won't say that they will vote in one bloc for one party, because recently the Khalistani movement has diversified their political pressure. So what they have done, they have put people in all three parties.
And here in Canada, that means primarily the NDP, the Conservatives, and the Liberals.
That's right. In the beginning, most of them were naturally with the Liberals for years. Then they thought that this is not good, as Liberal Party also became weak federally and Conservatives came. So they diversified. They put their efforts into PC Party, then Jagmeet Group headed to NDP, and they even cooperate. What is disturbing, that the separatists will cooperate from three parties in order to achieve something which was very visible when the civic elections took place in Brampton.
So listeners know Brampton, of course, is a neighboring city to Toronto, which has a particularly high concentration of South Asians and Sikhs in particular. Is there any sort of political outreach or cooperation between different South Asian diaspora groups, Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims? I think if you read the national media, there is this sort of assumption that there is a kind of one for all and all for one spirit among visible minorities. But I'm wondering, are there efforts, interfaith dialogues, interfaith political cooperation, or does everything take place within the silo of Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims and so forth?
No, everything takes place in silo. Although Hindus and Sikh communities are very close from Punjab, if we look at...
They're close geographically in their origins and in some cases...
Culturally
that's
as well.
right. And there are intermarriages among Hindus and Sikhs. And such a relationship do exist in Canada.
But does that extend to politics?
Politically, they are totally separate. There is no cooperation. If there is cooperation among Hindus, Sikhs and Muslims, that is based upon the political party. If you are a liberal, and you will certainly approach liberal Muslims for support or liberal Hindus for support.
But that's a political brand.
That's a political brand. It's not. There is no common kind of political lobby among Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims.
I might even approach this whole question, because you've raised a very interesting question, John, from a slightly different angle, and that is that, it's a reductionist way of viewing things, and yes, there's this common understanding that, or this assumption, I would say, that there are voting blocs. But is that coming less from the communities, and is that coming more from the politicians and the way that they look at us and define us?
Well, I think the politicians do need support. So they look at the voting blocs. They invite the voting blocs to come behind them. They need money. They need funding. The worst thing which is affecting, I think, Canadian democracy is the nomination system. So manipulation of a nomination system is the place where voting blocs do work.
And just to be clear for non-Canadian listeners, you're talking about local riding associations who put forward a candidate, but then, of course, it has to be approved by the leader of the party. So for the NDP, that would be Jagmeet Singh right now. For the Liberals, that would be Justin Trudeau. And so that's the system you're referring to.
That is the system. Yeah. That is where these minority voting blocs work the most. So once you get nominated, they think half the battle is won. Now it's up to the fortunes of the party to win the election.
Especially if it's in a safe seat for that party, the election effectively takes place behind closed doors at the riding level, where you pick which candidate is going to represent the party, and if it's a safe seat, they'll get elected.
They get elected. But if you look at the scenario today, you look at Brampton. a city of about 600,000 people and 5 federal ridings. All 5 federal MPs are Liberal because there was a wave, they all won, and all 5 are Sikhs. Now, if you look at the composition of Brampton, I don't think there are more than 25 to 30% Sikh population in Brampton. So for 25 or 30% of the people, they have 5 MPs, they are all Sikhs. It does not represent the demography.
As a Sikh, you should be happy about that, but you don't sound happy.
Well, I think you cannot force the other people to the corner just with your voting bloc, just by manipulating the nomination system and manipulating the leader.
But some would, if I could push back on that, some would say that Sikhs have done a very good job of recognizing how the system works, pushing for their interests, and I think they've been doing this, I guess, at least since the 70s or 80s, certainly at a local level. Whereas there are other groups who have been slower to this. They've pushed in business or other areas of civic life, but not federal politics. Some would say that good for the Sikhs for recognizing how the system works and leveraging local pluralities to get elected and get their interests represented.
When I look at the 5 Sikh MPs, I look at Brampton and I say, well, where is the representation of the other people? Very much same thing took place in the provincial election. So that's one issue.
And do you hear grumbling from other communities within Brampton about that?
We have seen in the civic election. The civic election, why Linda Jaffrey...
Tell us about who Linda Jaffrey is.
Linda Jaffrey was Brampton's mayor for last 4 years. She was running for re-election.
And what's her background?
She's a white Canadian. I don't know for which background.
Okay.
She was an Ontario minister before. She was an MPP and then she became minister, I think, in McGuinty's government or...
This is Dalton McGuinty's provincial Liberal government.
That's right. That's when she was MPP and she ran for Brampton's mayor and she won. Now, when she was running for re-election, that is where we saw that large part of the community of Brampton felt that, well, why should we support Linda Jaffrey? She's being surrounded by a certain group of people.
So she had support from the Sikh community, but the majority who weren't Sikh opposed her, partly on that basis, you're saying?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Because she was not a Sikh, but she was surrounded by not only Sikhs, but separatist Sikhs. And she was doing whatever they were kind of guiding her to do.
So in short, you had a career white politician who was leveraging a Sikh political machine at the local level. And she was rejected, you're saying, in part because people were alienated by that.
That's right. She was rejected by downtown Brampton, which are the old Bramptonians. A lot of them are English background. Then she was rejected by the Hindu Bramptonians, which felt that she was too close to the separatists. She was rejected by the moderate Sikhs, which also thought that she's too close to the separatists. And then she was rejected by a lot of Tamils also because they were somewhat close to Patrick Brown.
And these are just to be clear, these are Tamils from Sri Lanka.
That's right. They are also in very large numbers in Brampton. And for Tamils, I think the reason was that some of the groups were very close to Patrick Brown, who was challenging Linda Jaffrey.
And who in fact won.
Who in fact won. So we were talking about whether there is a resentment of too much Sikh representation. So this is the one example of over-representation of Sikhs in a particular community that the Bramptonians felt that this is not good. And second thing I will mention is that all those 5 MPs, I look at their performance, what they do. Look at the public security report of 2018. There was a small paragraph.
This is a federal government
report. Federal government by integrated security
integrated
agencies.
Threat assessment.
That's right. So there is a small paragraph. It says Sikh Khalistani extremist. Now, a lot of these Khalistani organizations and temples controlled by them, they were up in arms that we won't accept this. This has to be removed. This is injustice to us. Prove us. Or remove it, prove it or remove it. And all those 5 MPs, they were speaking the language of the separatist. They wanted this removed. they failed to stand by the assessment of Canadian intelligence agencies that there was some sort of a threat. And one MP at the end broke ranks with them.
This is one MP from Brampton.
From Brampton.
Who said that actually it is a threat.
He was under pressure in the beginning. He was with them. But once the Minister of Public Safety, Ralph Goodale, he promised that let's work on it. And I agree with you that we should remove the word Sikh so that it does not reflect that we are talking about the whole Sikh community. But then it was not acceptable to the other MPs. It became Khalistani extremist. If you remove it, it has not been done yet. If it was done, or it is done in the future, as the minister promised, from Sikh Khalistani extremist to Khalistani extremist, it becomes more specific. Mm-hmm. So they lose their burqa, which they have, the cover.
Veil of protection.
To mix metaphors a little bit.
So one MP broke ranks. Mr. Sangha from Brampton Centre said whatever minister promised is okay, is acceptable. And he also challenged them on one TV show that how many Khalistanis are there? There are only 1 or 2% Khalistanis. Why should we worry about it? Mm. That once the Sikh is removed, Sikhs are out of it, we are satisfied with it.
Niru, if I may ask you a question, going back a little bit to the micro-politics that Balraj was describing within Brampton, you are of Hindu background, and also you live closer to downtown Toronto. You don't live in Brampton. How much of the micro-politics that Balraj was describing resonates with you in terms of things that people within the South Asian diaspora community in Toronto as a whole speak of? Does any of this resonate in terms of stuff that people talk about casually when they talk about Toronto politics?
That's an interesting question, and it's pretty complex because, as you mentioned, I live in an urban situation. I live in the city. It has a lot to do with where people settle as well. And so a number of Indians tend to congregate in areas like in the GTA, if we're talking about Toronto, and Brampton, and Scarborough, Mississauga.
Brampton is a big city.
And these are
pretty
big
urban
cities
in itself, right?
Oh, yes. These are all big cities.
I don't want letters from Bramptonians saying that we're not an urban center. It's a big place, right?
It's not rural.
Right. Okay.
Right. It's a city. It's a proper city. But then when you have a concentration of a certain ethnic group, it becomes a bit of an ethnic enclave. And so I think people tend to pay attention to the micropolitics in a different way than we do here, say, in a more diverse community. I do worry about this perception that Canadian politicians have of us as ethnic voting blocs. It's very interesting to hear Balraj's perspective because it gives you a perspective on the nuances that take place from within that community. And it's not as clear-cut as one might assume it is, because there's factions within each ethnic group, and in this particular case, the Sikh group, that feel differently about the politicians. And I even wonder about the successor to Linda Jaffrey and wonder if he's, being propped up by some of these very same people that have, and I don't know, I have to confess, but I think I see him all the time at Gurudwaras.
This is Patrick Brown.
This is Patrick Brown, who is now the mayor of Brampton. And I wonder, because I see him at Gurudwaras, I know he's planning a trip to India. I know he's very involved within the South Asian community, and he has a groundswell of support. So who is it actually who's supporting him? It's fascinating to hear what's happening on the ground.
Well, I should say that as somebody who has some connection to the Jewish community here in Toronto, and I'm not an observant Jew, but I guess I'm a member of the community, I do recognize some of the patterns that Balraj, that you're describing when it comes to Brampton, because I know that not so much now, but certainly when Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau were contesting the election a few years ago, it's the Conservatives versus the Liberals, some of this kind of discussion was playing out in heavily Jewish areas like Hampstead and Côte St. Luc in Montreal and certain downtown areas in Toronto, where there was pandering to different parts of the Jewish community and accusations from other parts of the Jewish community saying we're being shut out, or Stephen Harper has surrounded himself with hardcore Zionists. Those accusations were fairly common. I won't get into the truth of those accusations, but the dynamics at times became very bitter, and it wasn't even clear that there was any kind of cohesive Jewish community vote that was going to go in any one direction. And I'm wondering if that's the case with the South Asian community more generally and the Sikh community. If at the end of the day, there's a fracturing of the vote, and although, Balraj, you've described the vote as being captured at the local level in terms of riding associations and such, it sounds like it's not having that big an effect federally because all of the parties are playing the same game. So it's not as if any one party has been captured by some of, as you described them, radical elements. Is that fair to say?
It's absolutely fair to say. I will give you one example. I do feel that the end result, which party will get more seats, it does not affect. But who get elected on behalf of that party, that is affected because of the nomination which took place before the elections. Now look at the last Ontario election in June. In Brampton, there was one MPP. She was also a minister for a while with Catherine Wayne, a Sikh, Harinder Malli. She was from Brampton North. She brought the motion of Sikh genocide to the Ontario Assembly or Parliament.
And that's commemorating the 1984 killings, where in fairness, thousands of Sikhs did perish.
That's right.
Yeah.
So all the Khalistanis were pushing this. So she managed to get it through. All three parties supported it. Even Patrick Brown's group supported it. So Harinder Malli, when she faced the election, she lost. Majority of the electorate in that area, a lot of voters in that area, especially Brampton North, they are Sikhs. And who won? The NDP candidate who belongs to the black community.
And do you think it was because of that motion that she brought forward?
No, it is not that she was opposed for the motion or she was supported for the motion. What I'm saying is, when comes the election time, the party wave or the party fortunes or the mainstream politics issues, they count. When it's a nomination, then you rush through the nomination, whoever you want.
And the nomination becomes a sort of
enough
silo.
Money in your pocket, you have enough people behind you, you don't need those people who are not even eligible to vote in the general election. They are not citizens. Even they can vote in nomination. A visitor to the country will be enrolled as a NDP, PC or Liberal member, and he will come and vote for you. The person is just maybe even illegal, maybe a student. All you do is you hire the member, you pay the membership fee $5-10, and then you kind of transport the person to the center to vote for you. And you.
So you're saying that's where they can really mobilize at the ground.
That is where
level.
All the bad things are taking place, which are kind of giving wrong direction to the politics of Canada.
Putting aside the question of residency and citizenship, or lack thereof, and the role that plays, because I imagine there would be people maybe who would contest that generalization. Putting that aspect aside, the radicalizing effect that takes place because of internal riding dynamics, to some extent, that's the complaint people have made about the nomination system in the United States, right? Where the Democrats and the Republicans both have become a little bit more radical in their beliefs because of the nature of the nomination system, where the people who are most motivated and most organized are the ones who put their candidates forward. So it's not limited to one community or even to one country, right?
Yes, but I think the U.S. nomination system is probably totally different than
it's different.
Than ours.
Yes, though the complaints are the same.
Complaints are the same.
Can I ask you about your role within the Sikh community? Because obviously you're highly outspoken and you're highly critical. Do you get invited to civic events? You run your own newspaper within the community. The views that you're talking about here, has that made you persona non grata at Sikh community events in Brampton or TV shows, radio shows, that sort of thing? Do people invite you to share your views, or are you ignored?
No. A lot of the radio shows, they call me whenever something happens to give my views on it. Some TV shows also do that.
So you haven't been blackballed or anything like that?
No, like I can go to any temple. I don't have a problem. A lot of the managements, they support the separatist views, but I'm on good talking terms with them.
Have you ever felt a sense of fear or a sense of fear for your own safety?
Back in 1985, I was attacked physically because of my views that I was not supporting.
What happened?
The separatist. I was attacked by some unknown people back then. At night when I was living in an apartment building and parking my car at night. I suffered serious injuries. Nobody was arrested. But later, slowly, the things filtered and we came to know who those people were. And 5-6 youth, they were with this movement. They slipped from here to Pakistan. They took some weapons training. They slipped to India. They took part in terrorist activities and killings and so on, and later they got shot by police, all 5 of them.
These were the ones who attacked you?
Well, yeah, that's right. Like, I did not know them at that time. I did not recognize them at night, who they were. Mm-hmm. But the chat in the community within few years indicated who those people were.
Right.
And that happened. But slowly, as community and Khalistani organizations realized after the trial of Air India, after Justice John Major's inquiry, that this will really give us bad name if something happens. So that is what caused them to back away. And now the inclusion in the public security report, that little paragraph about the Khalistani extremists, also indicated to them that they are being watched.
Mm-hmm. They're on alert.
They are on alert.
But what you're describing is good news. The fact that someone like you, who's an outspoken critic of extremists, that you participate freely in community events and prayer, that does count as good news.
Well, you need a lot of courage to do that. The privilege which I have now, after being a senior member of the community for 42 years, a lot of the people, whether they are on Khalistani side or non-Khalistani side, the community used to be very small back then. Mm. We know each other personally. So that privilege is not there for everybody. Like, others need a lot of courage, a lot of experience to come to a point where I have arrived now. So people are fearful when they want to, if they want to express their views. They will avoid offending anybody. But then at some point, like people like myself, and there are people like Ujjwal Dosanjh, he's very outspoken on this also, because we have a lot of experience behind us, like so we can justify what we are saying. That takes the fear away.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Ujjwal Dosanjh, because we know him as the former Premier of British Columbia and also the former Federal Minister of Health here in Canada. But he's also a non-turban Sikh, and he has very moderate views, and was, in fact, as we've alluded to before, beaten up quite severely for his views and holding a position against these radical elements within the community. In my interview with Terry Malefsky of the CBC, he also mentioned the attack that took place on you, and mentioned that there were a number of higher profile violent events that took place here in Canada. Not too many, thankfully, but still a number of very prominent ones. It does take courage to stand up to this. But thinking about politics generally, just changing tracks a little bit, you've talked about and identified the problem with the nomination system here in Canada. And we've talked about these voting blocs. We've talked about this reductionist view that people have. What would you say to politicians if you could address them directly and have them understand that we are a very diverse community within our community, and how, in fact, votes are even lost because they have misunderstood the way that we think and the way that we operate? There
are a number of things they can do. First of all, this multiculturalism is bogus. I think we should give up this word.
Okay, tell me, because that's been such an underpinning of our society. It's a value we cherish.
Well, present multiculturalism is supporting silos, ghettos of different communities. There has to be more stress on national integration. Without national integration, this blind multiculturalism will lead us somewhere where we will end up with the fragmented society.
Let me just push back a tiny bit on this, because it's hard to easily let go of an idea that you've always cherished, which is this idea that in a pluralistic society, we can each be ourselves and not become the melting pot, say that we sometimes observe that United States, the cultures within the United States become more American than they are their original traditional cultures. Is that what you're telling us we have to be? We have to be a little bit more like the United States, or we have to be a bit more of a melting pot? Is that the vision of a non-multiculturalist society?
No, I think we should be free as we are to practice some of our traditions, whether it's food or it's attire, the way you dress and so on, which we are quite tolerant. But when it comes to the policies, the problems, the solutions, we must deal with, whether it's civic or provincial or federal level, we must have Canadian vision. We must address those with priority. We should not talk about a specific religion and a specific group and their problems where they left the country, whether it is Syria or India or Pakistan. So that is not multiculturalism. That if that is multiculturalism, it will end us damaging us at the end.
What's your vision then? If it's not multiculturalism and not the silos, then how do we go about building? Well, we should
be more Canadian. We should look at the issues from Canadian perspective. If I live in Brampton, I should look at the issues from the point of angle of Bramptonians. Taxes affect all of the Bramptonians.
I think I'm beginning to understand you. So what you're saying is, let's not bring the problems from where we left.
That's right.
We come here and we start a new life. We have different values, and we are a common cause.
That's right.
What's interesting is the diaspora effect, because my understanding is that in the Punjab itself, when it's election time, Khalistani separatism, that sort of thing, has very little resonance with modern voters in India, in the Punjab. And interestingly, it sounds like has more resonance now in the diaspora community than back in South Asia. Is that the case?
That is the case. It's not only more in the diaspora, it's bouncing back from here now.
So describe how that process works.
Well, in Punjab, whenever there are elections from local level to provincial or federal level, all those candidates who are declared Khalistanis, they lose their deposits. They never win. But overseas, all the community institutions, Gurudwaras or the temples are the community institutions where people gather for the Sikh community. They are, all big ones are under control of pro-separatist lobby. So they are being used for all kind of propaganda and political
fundraising,
political pressure to the local politicians that, look, we are so many. Look,
by the way, I should say the Irish community in North America was alleged to have the same influence in regard to the IRA.
I remember that. Yeah. I remember that. Even in USA, the same issues were raised. So now they are trying to, through social media, through funneling money and so on, they are trying to support those separatist groups who are in Punjab to take more radical line. That is the case now.
By coincidence, we're having this interview in an area of Toronto that's just 2 blocks away from a bar on what's known as the Danforth here in Toronto, which apparently was notorious for that kind of fundraising back in the 70s and 80s. So to repeat a theme, these issues are faced by many communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you raised the topic of the gathering places principally for our communities, for our South Asian communities, is temples, Gurudwaras, temples, mosques. And so when politicians want to address us, or when the leadership of these places want to show their influence, they can show the membership as the groundswell support for their views. But maybe that is in fact the problem, and I want to get your opinion on this, because this was an idea that when I spoke to Ujjwal Dosanjh that he shared with me. He said, well, we have no secular institutions. We have no secular institutions where people can gather and where we can actually be addressed, not because we hold a particular not because we believe in a particular faith or practice a certain religion, but because of our views on other things. So where are the community centers and where are the other institutions in which these politicians can come and address us so that we don't feel like we are stuck in this narrow definition of how they see us. They see us as people who go to the temple and have this particular view because that's what the leadership wants them to see. So what's your thought on that? Do we need more secular institutions in our own communities?
There should be. I mean, not only Gurudwaras. Like when I look at Brampton, I'm getting old. Pretty soon I'll be a senior. I look at the senior organizations in Brampton. All those senior organizations, they are also kind of segregated.
They're organized by faith?
But yes, mostly. I mean, some Hindus and Sikhs will do mix with them. Odd Muslim may join. But mostly they are the Sikh seniors. There are a couple of Hindu senior groups dominated by Hindus. And the mainstream, or say the English seniors, or some French ground seniors, or black seniors, I don't see them mixing with them. They are all segregated.
Balraj Deol, thank you so much for joining us. If people want to contact you or learn more about you, or if they're Punjabi speakers, if they want to read your newspaper, where can they go online to find out more information?
If they can read Gurmukhi script in Punjabi, then they can go to Khabarnama.com. Khabarnama.com.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Balraj. That was amazing. It was great to hear your perspective.
Thank you.
This has been a production of TNKR Media. Good talk.